Please welcome the panel on Critical Minerals, Mining the Future Economy, moderated by Senior Director of Eldridge Industries, Ari Untracht.
Thank you guys for joining us today. We've got a pretty exciting panel here on a topic that is, by its definition, critical. Everyone's phone, everyone's device, weapons, our energy grid, cars are all powered by everything that's coming from the earth, whether it's lithium, whether it's copper, whether it's iron to make steel. This is a central part of our economy, and with this ongoing energy transition, it's about to get even more important and more significant than it's ever been before. By all intents and purposes, if we're going to meet any of these net zero targets or even get close to them, we're going to need something like 40 to 50 times more copper supply than we have right now. That's something like 100 Escondidas, which is the largest copper mine in the world. Basically, the point is that it's going to be almost impossible to deliver on this ongoing energy transition without more material or without better approaches to manufacturing, better approaches to recycling, and better approaches to our supply chain more generally. We've got a fantastic panel here. From the White House, we have Amos Hochstein. From Northvolt, we have Shauna McIntyre. From Masenko, we have Zimi Mecca. And from a new entity in Saudi Arabia, which has only opened up shop a few months ago, we have Amit. We're going to try to cover a combination of topics today, from the geopolitics around critical minerals, the reality at the coalface of the mine itself and what it's going to take to produce more, and the lack of investment that there's been in the sector for almost a dozen years now. And then we're going to get into some of the new approaches that people are taking to produce batteries in a more efficient way, to have a cleaner, more significant, stronger supply chain. And then we're also going to get into the opportunity for partner countries in the United States, including Saudi Arabia, who are looking at changing the scope of what we know about a country like Saudi, which we might think of historically as an oil nation, but in the future would love to become a high-tech manufacturing hub. So with that, what I'd love to do is start with Amos. And Amos, this discussion is something that we've had a couple of times before. Our supply chain is heavily controlled by a single country, largely China. We're realizing every day that that control comes with other challenges, not just today, but obviously in the future. Would love to get some of your perspective on the world we're in, the importance of this, and the sort of geopolitics and the sort of macro backdrop around it, and what we're trying to do in the United States and with partner countries to improve access to supply and improve the way we access that supply.
Well, thank you, Ari, and it's good to be here. I think it's good to have this conversation. I think when we talk about critical minerals and metals, and if we go away from the strict definition of the list of what is a critical mineral and just take it as a more, the broad definition of the common sense critical mineral, it's about, for the United States, we have to think about it in a number of different paths. Number one is securing supply chains of the United States for the growth that we need. We just passed, just a couple of years ago, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest investment in renewable energy and clean energy in the United States, and trying to ignite a build-out of the full supply chain, from mining to processing to the end use, including making sure that we're, what Shauna is doing, recycling of materials so we don't need as much. But that full values chain in the United States. However, we cannot do it all based on what is available in the United States. One, because we don't have all the rocks that we need and all the minerals that we need. And if we do, some of them are more accessible than others, and there are some competing interests when it comes to mining in the United States as well. But we need to look at how do we make sure that we have a supply that is secure, affordable, reliable, for US manufacturing, for US end users at the different levels. And that requires to go to the countries where these products exist, the mines have to be where the products can be mined. Lastly, we can't only think about the United States, because as the United States, we have a responsibility for creating and ensuring a global supply chain that is diversified. And you started already in your question where we have come to a place of real risk, both to clean energy, as well as to the growth of AI, data centers, cloud, as you said, weapon systems, phones, et cetera, because we have high concentration of products coming from one country, from China. Now, this is not a US versus China. We wouldn't want this to be the case in any country in the world. Graphite, processed graphite, is 97% from China. That doesn't mean all graphite is mined in China, but 97% of processing of graphite is in China. I don't know if there'll be a hurricane, an earthquake. I don't know what could happen that restricts the access. We cannot have a concentrated market. So we have to work with our allies to make sure that there is a globally diversified supply chain. That's why we have put an effort both domestically to encourage and to incentivize and finance through different tax incentives as well as loans and grants to do it in the United States. And we have to do the same exact thing about how do we finance through DFC, through Exim Bank, MCC, other arms of the US government, in collaboration with G7 countries to bring finance to unlock the investment here. Look, you talked about copper. If we want to build out a grid in the United States just to meet demand growth before AI, we need a lot of copper. With the advent of growth in AI, we're going to need significant amount of increase of power generation and transmission, which is going to require even more copper. And so we have to get a lot faster in what we do both domestically and around the world to make sure that we have this supply. And so this is both a geopolitical issue and a national security and national economic security for the United States to make sure that we have that. We launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment within the G7 in order to allow us to see those investments. We're investing not just in the mining itself, but in the surrounding infrastructure of the mining industry with US DFC, and through other agencies we are building out rail in some places, 3 and 5G in other places to support this. And I'll end with this. This is not just about coming to countries and say, work with the United States or work with G7 countries, don't work with China. They have the freedom to pick whoever they want to work with. But the idea is to say, what has happened to your country when you see the investment that's come from China, and 10 years later, how much more debt do you still have that is crushing debt? Are your communities better off? Are the communities around the mines today better off than they were 10 years ago when the mining started? And the answer to those, I think, are obvious, which is why we have to come to communities and say we have a better deal, we have a better offering collectively, not just the United States, but we have a better offering that will be better for your country and for your community, so that the clean energy economy, so that the AI future is not built on the backs of child labor and corruption and dirty practices, but rather on something that lifts the communities where those materials are mined, and that they're part of the growth that those materials are needed for, which is this new clean energy economy and a new technology, advent of a new technological world that's out there. And that's why it's this two-play of US on our own together with our allies.
So maybe just picking up on that point before maybe we move on and touch from this, from a collaboration standpoint, do you see the evolution of more multilateral relationships? Is it more bilateral, where you're having a direct discussion with, for example, Saudi Arabia? I mean, is there a coalition of the willing, so to speak, that's around this, that's focused on the same issues, that's willing to do the same kinds of things that the US government has now started to do to incentivize private capital and others to sort of engage in the sector in a deeper way than before?
100%. So we have to work with our allies around the world. Saudi Arabia is one of them. I've made many trips to Saudi Arabia. We're talking about the mining industry around the world and what role Saudi Arabia can play. We're working with our G7 partners, plus Australia, South Korea, and others. But it's also about putting together a finance coalition. Because at the end of the day, if you want to invest in, whether it's Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Mexico, Congo, Zambia, DRC, et cetera, Angola, these are different profile countries that have different kinds of risk associated with them. And Western finance has basically said, we will not be able to absorb this risk, and we won't, and the cost of capital to invest in these countries, therefore, is at levels that is not possible. So after you mitigate, after you put all the risk in, you end up with a 26% return on investment required, which is not exactly what is available in the market, and they walk away. So when countries say, look, I'm not working with the Chinese companies because I don't understand your concerns, they say, I'm competing between China and nothing. And in a competition between China and nothing, I will choose the one that I know may not be the best option for me. But I almost put an option on the table. And so we have been working with US and global finance as to how to bring the World Bank, the regional development banks, and to say, how do we mitigate the risk? Local currency lending is a huge problem. And it's a risk that companies are not willing to take. And if you're operating in a country where you cannot hedge the currency, how do you expect to finance it? The same goes for a number of other risks of reputational risk, corruption risk, political risk of somebody nationalizing the assets, which has happened. We have to have the tools. We know what they are, but we have to bring those tools in a pooled way. So how do we use the World Bank or the IMF or the IFC together with the US government, together with the DFC and the Exim Bank, KfW from Germany, et cetera, et cetera. How do we work on, how do we create these pools of capital that would de-risk the investment into these industries? If we don't, and we can just look at where we are now. You talked about copper. How many new projects are coming online? And it's not something that we develop, we find a copper deposit and we said it's going to come on tomorrow. It's going to take 7 to 10 to 12 to 14 years, depending on where it is. And there's nothing coming online. So we are both behind because of the concentration of investment, and we're behind because we don't have the finance out there that allows mining companies, infrastructure companies, to meet the goals that they need to have effective, affordable capital that will allow this investment.
Thanks, Amos. And as investors in the sector, we couldn't agree with you more. And I think we're thrilled to see what the U.S. government has begun to do, and excited about where it goes next. Kind of touching on this supply issue, I'd like to move over to Zimi. So for disclosure purposes, we announced the acquisition of Ausenco, the company that Zimi founded and runs the CEO back in September. They are one of the leaders in mine development around the world, have actually built more copper mines than anyone else over the last decade. And so Zimi sits, for lack of a better description, at the coalface of the supply challenge. Zimi, from your perspective, Amos has just kind of teed it up, I think, quite nicely. Copper mines don't come online immediately. Lithium extraction technology is still evolving, and we're not able to produce enough of it to meet future demand. What are you seeing? What are the challenges? What's really going to be built? What's not? A statistic that gets thrown out to me all the time is, of 100 exploration projects, maybe 1 will be mineable. Of anything that's mineable, maybe 1 out of 100 will actually get built. And so there seems to be this real lack of efficiency to sort of get to new supply. What are your takes?
Yeah, look, it's tough, Ari. I mean, mining is a tough business. It's capital intensive. The durations, as Amos said, are long. And all of the easy mineral, all of the easy copper near surface, depths of 200 meters, say, it's pretty much got, because people have been doing this for quite a while, and they all attracted to the near surface material that they can process, easily and quickly. And now what's happening is that ore bodies are getting deeper, harder to get to. Underground mining techniques are required. And, 20 odd years ago, we were mining 2% copper, and today we're down at 0.4. So that's a fifth of the grade of copper that we were mining 20 years ago. So you have to shift a lot of dirt to maintain the production of mineral or metal that you need. So there's a big challenge just in that. Capital costs are growing. So your return on capital, is quite important when you're deploying the big licks of capital that's needed. The exploration duration is very long. As Amos said, 7 years if you're lucky, but more like, sort of 15 to 20 for tier one assets, which there aren't many tier one assets being developed. Ari mentioned one called Escondida in Chile that BHP are the major shareholder in. It's the biggest in the world. And it produces 1.4 million tonne of copper a year. We need for net zero at least 60 of those. And that's just not going to happen overnight, Exploration, because it's high risk, doesn't necessarily attract the capital that development does, because essentially you're a venture capitalist when you're exploring. The hit rates are quite low, so the returns are really great once you find a deposit, but there's a lot of, as Ari said, dusty holes until you find one. But the quantum is scary. An electric vehicle uses 6 times the amount of copper that an internal combustion engine vehicle does. Lithium, 5 years ago, the world produced 80,000 tonne a year of lithium. Today it's 1 million, and 4 million is required. So that industry is evolving, the technology is evolving at a rapid rate. And we're going to hear shortly, I'm sure, from Shauna on recycling, but just at the sort of the basic numbers, what's required is quite large and challenging and not going to be turned on overnight. So it's getting harder, I hate to say it, harder rather than easier.
So I want to come on to Shauna in a minute, but maybe before we do that, is there anything new that you're seeing technologically that might improve your ability to extract, process, mill in a quicker, faster, more efficient way? One thing we always kind of get confused on is the quantum of carbon that gets emitted through production and the disturbance of soil itself. Is there anything that you're seeing that just will change the way we mine?
I think on the lithium side, yes. Lithium, essentially, you can mine from hard rock, or you can mine from or extract from brines, which are salt-bearing aquifers or lakes that exist that carry lithium, magnesium, and other metals. But the technology to extract that lithium is the lowest cost and also the lowest carbon footprint. But there are some challenges with what's called DLE technology, direct lithium extraction, which are still being developed and honed. I think over the next 5 years that's going to happen. But in the meantime, hard rock is probably where we are with efficient lithium mining. And you shift a lot of dirt to extract, sort of 1.5% lithium. Then you've got to you produce a concentrate to sort of 6%, and you transport that concentrate to China to get processed. So you're transporting 94% of beautiful West Australian dirt all the way to China to be sort of stored in a tailings dam. So yeah, it's quite intense. So,
Shauna, I want to sort of pivot to you on this. I think what you guys are doing at Q-Berg is fascinating, and love for you to give kind of a minute on it as well, considering you're also fairly new in the role and sort of moving the company and the organization into a new place. But one of the things we've discussed is, and almost you've echoed it as well, this isn't just about finding supply; it's about finding supply in a better way. Mm-hmm. and looking for opportunities to use existing material more efficiently or to recycle materials more efficiently, and having a supply chain that you can feel a lot prouder about than maybe we've been historically. Would love to hear some of your views on that evolution, what you view as possible, what feels more sci-fi. What can we do more effectively than we are right now so that we don't have to build another 60 plus Escondidas?
Yeah, exactly. Excuse me. It was great to be here. Thank you. So Shauna McIntyre with Qberg, CEO of Qberg, which is a subsidiary of Northvolt. And just to set the stage, Northvolt is a 6,500-person company, a relatively new entrant into the battery world, based in Sweden, and now with 50 billion in an order book and over 15 billion raised in public-private money. Very good example of a relationship, I would say, with European Investment Bank over in Europe that really fueled the company from the very beginning. Excuse me. And so I run the high-performance division called Qberg, or a subsidiary called Qberg. We remove the graphite out of the anode of the battery. And so we have what's called lithium metal technology. And what this does is it removes, obviously, a substantial amount of the raw mineral, but it gives a lighter weight battery. So we're the first to market now with the first third-party validated module. And so I'm excited about where we're going. I have a long background in commercializing new technologies into the automotive industry, primarily. When you mentioned SciFi, what I would still coming around to the idea of batteries in the sky, powering aviation, but when you can make those batteries lightweight enough, then you can actually start to make a difference in regional air mobility and other types of air mobility to get rid of fossil fuels. So when it comes to then the raw mineral content and the challenges that are in the industry, you know, to build on your point about the amount of earth that has to be ravaged to get a small amount of mineral content, some of the work we've been doing to see what that impact is, you know, we have 700 or so tons of brine that need to be moved for every 1 ton of lithium. And then cobalt is even worse. We haven't talked about cobalt, where, you know, that is actually 300 tons of actual cobalt ore have to be refined to get 1 ton of cobalt for the battery. So Northvolt's mission is not just to produce batteries, it's actually to do it in a sustainable, reliable, and humanitarian way. So we go out of our way to find mines that hit our criteria for being at those levels that we expect. And it's fascinating to see the different reaches of the world where we can find mines. In northern Scandinavia, our mines are from many, many different areas, plus then the sustainability of the mining and the sustainability of our own plants. Our gigafactory up in northern Sweden is 100% powered by the runoff, the hydropower. So the whole supply chain is sustainable down to the recyclability of the product. And one of the reasons that the company went with the nickel metal cobalt on the, manganese cobalt on the cathode side is for the purposes of recyclability. So we find that by recycling and using recycled materials of the batteries, we can reduce the carbon footprint of a substantial amount. We now, at today's carbon footprint, we're at 1/3 of what the industry is. So we have about 33 kilograms of carbon equivalent for every kilowatt hour, watt hour, excuse me, of battery, versus the industry is about 3 times that. And our goal is to be at excuse me, at even a factor below that. So at 10 kilograms of carbon equivalent versus 100 today in the industry.
So let me ask you this. Is the importance of improving this, you know, from an efficiency standpoint in terms of having a cleaner supply chain, so to speak, maybe a more efficient level of production economically makes a lot of sense. Do you think there's going to be a consumer demand requirement at some point in time around understanding where material comes that sits in your battery, that sits in your car? And we were talking about this earlier. I always think about, if I look at a can of Coke, I realize, no disparaging to Coca-Cola, how many terrible things there are in there, but I know what's in there, right? I don't know what's in my Tesla. I don't know what's in the battery that powers the Tesla. I don't know where the wire came from. Is there a point in time where we're going to get there where consumers and others are really going to want to understand the depth of where this material comes from?
Well, if you think about where we've come from, I think the reason that those can, where you know what's coming, your ingredients in your Coca-Cola can and whatever you eat, was driven largely by the government. And so I don't think it's necessarily just consumers who want to know how many calories they eat or where their goods come from. I think the role of government is critically important there. And it should be. Like today's, on every vehicle, you have the sticker and it shows a percentage content in the US. Well, why doesn't it have that all the way through to the end of the supply chain to know where the ore came out of the ground versus just being laundered somewhere in a different area. As you said, you send things to China. These minerals get refined and remanufactured, refined in a lot of different subcomponents. So to be able to define where these things come from down to the very mine, I think is quite important. Excuse me.
Thanks. So I'd like to shift a little bit to the Middle East and to Ahmed. And I think what's kind of interesting about this panel is we've got sort of a perspective from where people are mining ore on the ground, some of the use cases, obviously the broader sort of backdrop. But Ahmed, you sit in an interesting role, also a new role, also in a new organization, a lot backed by the Saudi government. I think for most of us, when we think about Saudi Arabia historically, and Daniel Jurgen was unfortunately unable to participate in this panel, we think about energy, and in particular, we think about oil. But having just returned from the kingdom, there's a desire for Saudi to become very different than it was before. And I think you're now developing an organization that's very focused on the refining and the value add and the downstream production coming from critical minerals for all sorts of different purposes. Why don't you take us through a little bit about what's happening in the kingdom right now around minerals, in particular, what you're building out through Alat?
Yeah. So thanks for having me. First of all, Alat is a global company, headquartered in Riyadh. Alat in Arabic means nifty devices, machinery, tool. That's what the name is. And we're super proud to be here. One of the announcements we made today is around energy transition and electrification. And as you start to put the lens of just energy transition, you realize that clean energy requires 4 to 6 times more metals and minerals than the traditional. Within that framework, when you see the traditional energy infrastructure has been growing 2 to 4% a year, now offshore wind has to grow 20%. But when you start to look at some of the grid infrastructure has to go 29% or more. So every day, the gap starts to grow more and more towards what we think we want to get to, carbon zero, and what the reality is today. This is even more stark when you turn that into minerals and materials. And if you think 29% of the grid growth and the gap that is growing every day is a bigger one, think about the metal and minerals intensity of an offshore turbine versus normal gas turbine. Takes 16x more metals and minerals than the gas turbine. 16,000 kg per megawatt versus 1 kg per megawatt. So that just tells you that. You can go down even further and say, okay, how about onshore versus coal? It's 5x. And the list goes on. So as we transition to new energy infrastructure, the gap starts to get bigger and bigger in terms of what we have and what we need. So our aspiration versus realities have a big gap. Now, battery energy storage system, you could choose to do mechanical, thermal, electrochemical. There's many options available. But we will need all of them because you need some short-term duration, you need some long-term duration. So you're going to need all sorts of storage at the grid resilience level, at the city level, at the utility level. All of the solutions will be required. But now when we start to come into this, by 2040, these are the stats, there's few of them. Lithium, 90% of lithium will be used by energy infrastructure, if you include EV. And that intensity of lithium, what lithium was used in 2020 versus 2040, it goes up almost 42 times. Graphite, 25 times. Cobalt, 21 times. Nickel, 19 times. Rare earth materials, 7 times. These are massive numbers. And if you have to move more earth to extract the same what you did, amount of earth you have to move, amount of processing you have to do, start to become unfathomable. And to the point where we need real innovation in many aspects of things, including efficiency side, including distribution side. So all of those things are becoming very, very important. What becomes even more important is that where the rare earth materials is concentrated. It's much more concentrated industry than oil and gas. You have rare earth material, 85% come from single country, cobalt comes 65% from single country, and lithium, 55% come from single country. That is also the additional challenge from geopolitics and the supply resilience perspective that we have to think about. And the further downstream, once you have deployed this technology, you're creating new kind of waste. You have discarded batteries, you have discarded product. And just, there is 1.5 terawatt hours of discarded batteries coming onto the supply stream. And the best you can get out of that is, basically 1.2 megatons of different metals and materials. So it's end-to-end, this has to be solved, both from, from a metals and mining perspective, to power generation, to distribution, to productization, the new technologies, as well as finally the circular nature of the industry side. So it's a fascinating industry for someone like you to think about it. It's a fascinating industry for us to look at it. I mean, Saudi Arabia is leaning in. We have been funded by PIF by $100 billion to look at multiple industries. One of our sister company, Ma'aden, is exploring 48,000 square kilometer land for rare earth materials as well as for copper. So it's a phenomenal opportunity that we are blessed to have energy under the ground, energy above the ground, and now metals and minerals that are going to power the energy infrastructure for the future.
I mean, what do you think is an encumbrance to the development of a high-tech manufacturing hub in Saudi Arabia? You've obviously got low-cost energy supply. What you don't have is a ton of material, unless you obviously find it through the work that's going on right now. What do you need from partner governments? What do you need from other technology providers or service providers? Like, what's your biggest challenge to sort of really create that new subsector, create new jobs, new types of jobs for people in Saudi?
So a couple of interesting things I would like to share with you. One, we have the lowest cost of energy today. We will also going to have the lowest cost of clean energy in the world, in Kingdom. So you can see, think about $1.50 per kg of hydrogen, 2 cents or lower cost for clean energy. Today, it could be 1 cent to 6 cents, depending on how you look at the total energy. And so, first and foremost, we have the capital, we have the sun, we have the cleanest, lowest cost energy, clean energy. Now what we want to do is to build an industry. We need meaningful and sizable partnership around the world. We want to be trusted partners and secure supply chain to enable the outcomes for the future. And we want to make sure that to enable all of that, we need innovation and talent. And that's the journey that we are on. We want to be meaningful player. Our brand motto is tomorrow made better. And we want to lean in hard to make tomorrow made better. All of our energies, all of our industries will be powered by clean energy. And we're very proud of that. So what we are looking for is meaningful partnership, being part of the trusted partnership program by many governments, as well as secure supply chain that is needed to power the industry of the future, society of the future, and create the outcome that is a good for all. We want to be a force for good.
Thanks. I'm sorry, come back to you for a second on this topic as well. No one here can replicate what China has done, nor are we trying to replicate it. I think we're trying to provide an alternative for different sources, different capabilities, different processing opportunities. What do you think we're not doing from a US government standpoint to incentivize further development in countries where the material sits, or to partner with, with other countries to sort of create more connectivity independently of the Chinese? Is there anything that sort of comes to your mind as to what's missing?
First of all, I think a lot's missing. One, sense of urgency. We have a real problem, and we like having conversations, whether it's conferences like this or on Wall Street or London or wherever we are around the world, around the end use. So where are we on EVs? And we want to talk about who's making the EV and who's leading and what's the technology behind it. We like to talk about look at this conference, how many panels do we have on AI? How many panels at this conference do we have on what are the water resources and power resources that are required to build out the infrastructure build out for AI. A lot fewer, if any. The same thing when it comes to the EV. Like, we can talk about EVs all we want, but where are we going to make the batteries from? Now look at the two ends of the spectrum. Zimi's talking about we have to build mines. At the end of the day, whether we like it or not, you got to drill in the ground in order to get the products out. And you have Shauna is telling us that there's sort of the future of what a battery could look like that will use significantly less of these materials, A, because of recycling, and B, because the battery itself will be lighter and more efficient, and hopefully lighter doesn't mean also lower mileage, but we can have to have lighter and longer. And so, but that's going to take time. The batteries that we have today versus, I don't know what it's going to look like in 2040. I know it's going to be more efficient. But I have a demand curve that we're all talking about constantly in renewables, in EVs, in phones, technology that uses some of these materials, and in AI data centers and cloud. And I'm not having enough of a conversation of what kind of a crisis I have because the math doesn't add up. If I count all of what is being developed or is already in existence with what is necessary. So if I take the numbers, some want to see 50% new car sales in the United States by 2030 will be EV. That's a tough metric to achieve, but let's say it's only 35. And we want to get to 75% by 2035. The EU wants to be at 100%. Asia wants to be at growing numbers. Now do the math on that. The same way that you do it for that, do it for AI and for other technologies that require these rare earths, that are not so rare, but rare earths and critical minerals and metals. And the math doesn't add up. So one, I don't think we have enough of a sense of urgency, neither in industry nor in government. B, cost of capital. We will not solve this problem with the cost of capital the way it is today. And we are working hard to be able to achieve that. It is not an easy thing to do. And a mindset change of investing in these areas. It's easy. There's a lot of folks that want to invest in batteries, in hyperscalers. A lot fewer want to invest in power generation, in transmission lines, and in mining. The returns are not as good or attractive on those, and the companies that need the end product don't like to have that on their balance sheet. So you have to solve those problems. So I think we have to, and then there's regulation, which I know I'm here from the government talking about regulation, but we have to make it a lot faster to be able to attract it. That's part of the reason that we as the United States government are having so many conversations with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, with Qatar, with the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, Singapore, in order to bring in additional sources of capital that are able to invest in this and that bring something else to offer. So we know what we bring to the table in the United States, and that's why we've done the IRA. Our goal was not to compete against Europe, but rather to say to countries around the world, we've done the IRA, don't fight us, do the same. There needs to be more capital, there needs to be more tax incentives and grants that are there in order to incentivize it. I think Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries are doing a similar experiment of saying, we have low-cost energy, our land is relatively cheap, our regulatory environment is knowable and is certain, and we can then be part of, even if we don't have the mining in Saudi Arabia or in other countries in the Gulf, we can be part of the solution on reducing the cost of processing, do it with clean energy. And it goes back to the question that you asked, Sean, at the beginning on the label. And I don't know the question about whether the public will want to say, my EV came from, has cobalt from DRC, and which mine in DRC, was it a clean mine or was it a dirty mine? And I can tell you, was it a mine with child labor or was it a mine that adheres to international standards? That's a very difficult bar to reach, but I think it's part of how we create some kind of a more globalized and diversified system that says those who are willing to make batteries and have processing facilities that are powered by coal, maybe that's not how we want the clean energy future to look like. So there's a lot of different components here. Part of it is the private sector, part of it is sort of the NGOs and nonprofits that will look at it. But in all of it, we are going to have a government working together with private sector to be able to accelerate the part of the industry and the part of this energy transition and technology transition that may not be the most popular thing to talk about at salon conversations or in boardrooms as they're pitching projects for investment. And that's where the challenges are.
I think I might build on that and say that oftentimes the government doesn't get the credit for driving markets. The regulation is often deemed a bad thing, and it's obviously oftentimes very expensive for companies to invest in new areas that are being regulated, but it also drives a technology curve, an innovation curve that's a natural byproduct from it. So many years ago, I was part of the clean air legislation, working actually on internal combustion engines of all things, and in turbocharging, and actually it drove our market because we had to add a lot of technology to clean up the tailpipe before it went out the tailpipe. And that was a whole industry that it built a whole knowledge base of aerodynamics and lubrication and all these different areas that employed a lot of people and cleaned up our air. And so now it's a similar story that if there is stronger government regulation for things like understanding raw mineral content on a vehicle or where it comes from, I agree it's going to be hard. We'll have to know where to draw that line. But the carbon footprint of a vehicle is a metric that should be more on the tip of our tongues as we then think about what product is competitive or not. And if you look at the US auto industry right now, I'm really fearful of the fact that there is a gaping hole of this lower cost vehicle that's a fun vehicle to drive. The Chinese have already taken over 8% of the European electric vehicle market. That's what compelled a lot of people to invest in my company, my parent company. The same thing could happen in the US. So we need to understand where these vehicles come from, where these products come from, and by legislating it, then I think there could be an opportunity to protect our local environment, our local industry, to have products if they are indeed more sustainable and can be more competitive from that perspective.
Oh, don't get me wrong, I think you're 100% right. And I think certain countries in Europe are committing, it's like slow walk into their own demise.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about countries where the auto industry is a significant part of the economy and allowing a below-cost dumping of a car that is sold at below cost of manufacturing that does not adhere to, that its carbon footprint of that car is actually significantly higher because it's being produced with coal. These are knowable things. And we're now sitting year after year and saying, are you going to do something about it? And the answer is no, because we're reaching toward a consumer that wants a cheaper product. And if you want the cheaper product, that's where the role of the government is, because the consumer and the company, because the shareholders are going to say you need to buy the cheapest components so that you have the cheapest car, and the consumer is going to say I want to buy the car for the best bang for the buck. And if we have to step in sometime and say, yes, this is a short-term sugar high that will then crash. And when you crash from that sugar high, you will be left with no auto industry, with no security of supply, with another country that can say, I don't want to sell you any cars anymore, or any solar panels, or any wind turbines, or products that you need for your data centers and for chip manufacturing, because I'm going to use that as a geopolitical win. So that's, or a pressure point. But we're witnessing today a collective suicide on this issue. And so we have to take extraordinary measures in the United States to first protect the industry in the United States, to protect the economy, to secure our supply, and to make sure that we are not beholden to any other government. We saw this, that it's not just about political pressure, but during COVID, supply chains were disrupted not because of politics, but because of a pandemic. So we have to have this solution. And I think you're right that part of, if we can look at if the carbon footprint can be part of that solution together with other regulatory and taxes and tariffs and other things, I think that is what we need to do. But when you asked before, what are we missing? We're missing this sense of urgency that Shauna is talking about. These are real consequences for not for our children, but just for 3 to 5 years from now.
Exactly. Exactly.
I think the EVs are definitely big pressing issues, but to me, what you talked about, AI infrastructure, just to think about it, just put this in context. in 5 years, from 23 to 28, the power used by AI applications will go up 212 times. And remember, AI is on an exponential curve, which means if you take it to 29 and 30, it's going to be 400 times higher than where it was just last year. The point is, if you are, human brains cannot embrace the exponential curves that well. We're more tuned to the linear curve. Infrastructure is falling apart every day, further behind to what you need for 2030. Even just simple as a grid, just transmitting the piece. Generation is, itself is a huge problem too from a renewables. Even if you can get the renewables on the ground, if you can secure the land, you need a connection to the grid. And the grid needs to be able to transport it. Now all of a sudden you have to take the power generation next to consumption. People are talking about taking SMR, small mobile reactors, and putting it inside data centers. When did we say civilian technology, data centers can be anywhere? Now you want to put SMR next to this because we don't have enough copper, we don't have enough cable, we don't have enough grid, we don't have enough infrastructure investment going, and we're falling behind. So that's where I'm saying is minerals are just part of the story, but overall, if we think we are moving to new era, which is everything is going to be driven by AI, given all the discussions I've had, they are power hungry. Yes, new chips are coming. That's going to cut the power by 40 to 60%, but the work is exponential. That means demand is going to continue to grow. So if US and other friendly nations don't take the advantage of investing into the grid, investing into infrastructure, power particularly, I think the AI will get choked out. It will go somewhere else. Saudi Arabia is investing $266 billion in next 5 to 6 years just on the clean energy infrastructure and the grid. This is what needed in all our friendly nations as well.
Isn't that pointing us to nuclear power?
That's it.
Right?
That's it.
It's probably not a popular topic, but zero carbon footprint virtually. SMRs, small mobile reactors. It's to me, it's logical. It's coming, but there needs to be a whole sort of shift along the emotional curve with it. But from a technical perspective, you'd have to say that it would solve a lot of that problem.
Yep. I think
not a popular thing.
Yeah, no, it may be many solutions, but nonetheless, no matter how you do it, the grid is going to become
it's going to be choked up. Yeah.
That one is itself is, U.S. is at least a couple of decades behind where it needs to be based on Bloomberg's article. So that investments, there was an article in Bloomberg talking about you can't transmit energy from West Coast to East Coast today because there are 3 different grids that they can't hand over, right? My point is there's not a single grid. And that's what you need because where energy is produced and where energy is consumed are 2 different things.
So what, when you think about that from a private capital standpoint, where should private capital be mobilizing it? Should it be at the coalface, so to speak?
Pick me.
I'm raising money.
Should it be in efficiency drivers? What should private capital be doing? The idea of mobilizing capital into places like DRC are maybe more challenging for some organizations, and certain companies, without naming names, have come out and said they're not going to source cobalt from DRC anymore, which seems almost impossible considering the country represents 65% of supply, and a good portion of it is absolutely clean and totally appropriate. But where would you guys like to see capital focused right now when we think about that sort of full vertical from upstream to midstream to downstream?
I'll kick it off, Ari. I think the important thing is around the exploration, okay? And exploration these days is very technical. There's a lot of new AI technologies being employed to make it more efficient. But if we're not finding commodity in the ground, and the rest of it's just pretty feeble, really. We have to be finding new ore bodies. And like I said, it's high-risk capital, it's venture capital. But if we don't do it, we're going to struggle. We're going to struggle finding the metal that's needed in whatever form that looks like.
Yeah. And Chandra, from your perspective, when you think about your supply chain right now, is there enough of what you would view as quality source from the right types of sources to support the future demand of the product that you guys are developing just in a very specific way?
Yeah, no, I think that's where there's going to need to be a lot more investment. But when you think about private investment, I think that's where private investors, the timeline for their required return, their cost of capital today is very high. And so where is the best role for private capital in that equation? Fortunately, I've been in the hardware startup world for a long time to know that the venture capital market tends to be very short-term focused. And so the time horizon for investors needs to be matched with then the time horizon of development and the time it takes to then bring a new technology to market. So I believe that the further away you are from the customer, from the end use application, tends to be longer to deploy, longer to validate, longer to build up a mine, for example. Same for battery manufacturing. It's a long process. So private capital, certainly it's important. Every drop in the ocean creates an ocean, but we need those public forms of financing as well that will be a much larger scale and probably a more patient investor.
Got it. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got a bunch of questions coming in from the audience, and anyone who wants to ask a question, please use your QR code, I'm told. In no particular order, I'm going to fire a few questions out. I'm going to start with you, Zimi. A lot has been made about deep sea mining and mining of asteroids, all of which still sounds absolutely fantastic and absolutely impossible. Are those things that you see as reasonable, sort of areas of focus for the next 20 years, or is it really pie in the sky?
Yeah, no, I think deep sea mining has got some potential. It's nodule mining, it's deep. There's been lots of trials with it. But I think it's a 20-year journey. It's not something that's going to happen next year or the year after. Asteroids, well, yeah, that's an interesting one. I think exploring on planet Earth's hard, let alone on an asteroid zipping through space. And trying to convince someone, or maybe it's easier to convince someone that there's metal in an asteroid and you can raise lots of capital doing it. But I think that's probably got a long ways off.
So let me ask you another question for the panel, and anyone can sort of comment on this. We're all echoing the same point about a lack of supply to meet future demand, for whatever the purpose is of whatever it is you're trying to enrich or process, smelt or otherwise. We've seen the copper price run over the past year, and that's been a great indicator reflecting that. But we've seen lithium pricing go materially down. We're seeing mining companies still trading at pretty low single digits. BHP announces its acquisition or an acquisition of Anglo, or its attempt to acquire Anglo, a large portion of which is obviously a derivative of copper. Why aren't we seeing a greater reflection in commodity pricing on that lack of future supply right now?
Yeah, I think lithium price is sitting at about where it was 3 years ago, which was an all-time high for lithium products, and then it ran on a bit of froth, I think. It's pulled back, but it's still, at a pretty reasonable rate that you can make pretty good money if you own a good asset. So I think we're always going to see that in commodities. People hedge, people speculate, and so you're going to see fluctuations. But where it's landed, I'm on the board of a lithium producer in Australia, and we're making really good margin at the current numbers. I think copper is the one for me that I don't particularly understand why it's not $15 a pound at the moment, given that there's only 100,000 tonne of free supply sitting on the London Metals Exchange out of a 22 million tonne a year market. It should be a lot higher, and maybe there's a lot of metal sitting in Chinese warehouses where the Chinese do stockpile material, and it's pretty hard to determine what it is and how much they've stockpiled, and maybe that's driving it to a certain degree. But just based on supply-demand fundamentals, you'd expect this metal to be well over $10, $12 a pound.
So I think the markets are efficient, but not efficient all the time, right? I mean, things move slow until they move fast. And I think the realization of copper being so critical for electrification to so critical for AI, and it's sort of, that part is still being talked about, but hasn't really reflected in pricing. But to me, electrification is the core single thesis in which you can make an investment and generate a great return, whether it's copper or many other things. Electrification is for sure needed for world to transition over to what's next.
So I want to come to you on a question here related to this as well. Most of our future supply is clearly not going to come from North America. That's at least how it feels right now. Maybe that changes over time. Maybe more exploration happens here. Maybe we develop more operating mines. But most of the work that groups like Ausenco are obviously doing, new mines, expansion of mines is coming in Chile, Peru, Zambia, obviously Indonesia from a nickel standpoint. The tension around nationalization, the tension around labor unions. We've seen what's happened in Panama right now. Things feel a little bit more fragile. Maybe they're not, maybe they are, maybe we're just more aware of it. But what is the role of our government on a go-forward basis in supporting governments through fairly complex times with their people in environments that we're looking to secure supply from? And how do we increase or improve the playing field, so to speak, around supply? I mean, something that people always seem to forget is the LME is actually owned by the Chinese as well. And yet it's the price setter. And that sort of conundrum when we're sort of terrified of increasing control from a single country feels like an increasing problem. So I'm curious from a government-to-government standpoint, where you think we should be playing, not playing, engaging, not engaging, to help support that supply.
So I'll start from the end of your question. I think that the issue of price, and I take Zimi's point that lithium had a run, but we've also seen a collapse in a number of metals this past year. We've seen it come at a coincidental timing of certain companies trying to then purchase assets or increase equity positions in mining companies to take over assets. And so with so much stockpiling in China, controlling the LME, and then the ability to come in and bid on projects when the price is depressed, all of that has happened in the last 12 months. And I think it's not a coincidence that it happened in the last 12 months when there's been an awakening over the last couple of years where there's been a lot of press around the US is coming in for the first time back into Africa, back into Central and South America, back into some parts of Southeast Asia, whether it's Philippines, Indonesia. And there is a position taking of making sure they have a lead and they want to maintain it. So I don't think this is entirely a free market. I don't think it ever was. I think very little of the global energy system has ever been a free market. It is, the oil and gas world was never a free market. It still isn't. And we are growing into, from the fossil energy world structure to a market structure of the 21st century in clean energy that is leaning increasingly towards a very similar structure to what the fossil industry was, which is highly controlled by a small number of state actors, which is not what we envisioned for the clean energy future. And we have to accommodate for that. So I think that our role here is, as a government, is to not allow the conversation to be companies saying, I won't invest in country X. I find that to be, first of all, bizarre, as you said, when 65% of current production, but about 80% of the resources in that country. But rather to say, how do we say, in this country, we, with the United States government, together with our allies, working with private sector to say, we'll support you to make sure that the corruption pressure is not there, and work with countries and say, look, this mine needs to be up to international labor standards. And we know what they are. They're not very hard. And to say that they have to live up to environmental standards where you're not moving rivers and you're not polluting waterways and aquifers. And I think if we all insist on those, that will encourage companies that are worried about reputational risk to say, I have somebody backing me. We will provide some first loss and some other de-risking capital that will then encourage other sources of capital to come in. And I think if we can bring capital that is not replacing private capital, but rather incentivizing it, then I think we will have investment in Zambia and in Angola and in Tanzania and maybe even in DRC and in the Philippines and in Indonesia and yes, in Chile and Mexico and Argentina and Brazil. Those are the places where the rocks are. We can all say and live in the capitals and cities around the world and say, I don't want to do business there. But what you're really saying is we're not going to have an energy transition. Because the energy transition is not going to happen if it can only be produced in where I live, under my standards. Because the reality is if you do that, it won't be able to compete. And then you won't be able to produce it in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, and other places. Because the other stuff will be cheaper and without those mechanisms. So I think the government has a real role here to play of incentivizing private capital by taking more risk in this initially, in a responsible manner, but more risk to allow the private sector to come in, augment it, and allow that investment so that we have a diversified, sustainable, and equitable energy transition. And again, as Amit said, this is not just about the energy transition and EVs. This is as relevant to AI and cloud as it is to EVs.
So we're running up on time. I want to thank all of you guys for participating today. I think some of the takeaways I have from this are a sense of urgency is needed. Government has started to do some, I think, fantastic things here in the US. We'd like to see more from others as well. I think we're seeing a change in what historically we think about certain parts of the world, including in Saudi and what Amit is doing with a lot. And I think taking different approaches to manufacturing and improving the way we secure supply through the lens of a Cuberg and Northvolt is a great way to go. But I would urge everyone here and otherwise to sort of look at how we can do more. And I think we're going to have a follow-on in a private conversation amongst a few of us here. And thank you guys for all being here and participating.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for attending our lunch program. Be sure to utilize the mobile app to stay up to date on the latest changes. Check out what is happening at the Wellness Garden and other fun offerings throughout the conference. The next session will begin at 2:30 p.m.